In this tutorial, you'll be learning the 4 guiding design principles and the CRAP acronym, as well as some basic rules for typography or font use. After we look at those, you'll take what you've learned and create a design scheme. A design scheme is used when you're creating a document like a yearbook or a company brand, where you'll be using some repeating design elements and where you want a cohesive look for a brand. Now, I know CRAP is kind of a funny acronym, but I think the fact that it's funny works for us because it's the only thing that I can always remember. CRAP for us stands for contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. First, we'll look at contrast. Contrast is something that my students typically struggle with quite a bit. You really just think that you know that you like 2 colors, and so you think that they'll go well together. And that's not always true. When we're designing, we have to think about what are we going to print and what is going to be on the computer. Now, white and yellow might look okay together, but they don't have very high contrast. And so when you go to print them, you won't be able to read that very easily. Now, on the other side, if you use yellow and black, that's very high contrast, and your words, like in this example, will just pop out at you. Now, some of the contrast is okay as far as web goes. With the purple and the black, we wouldn't want to print that out. It wouldn't have enough contrast. But if you're just going to keep it online, it would usually have enough contrast that you can see it okay, just like in our example here. The white and the purple would be good for web or for print. Now, if you look at the next couple of examples, you'll just see a few more things that I'm talking about here. Repetition is the next design principle that we'll look at. And you can have repetition in a lot of different ways. Here in this example, we have repetition in the font choice. The headline font and the secondary font are repeated on the monthly, the daily, and on the mouse design. You can also see that the graphic is repeated as well as the color scheme. You have the arrows in the coral and gold and in the mint and the gold. And then the font is also repeated in the titles on the daily and on the titles on the monthly and the mouse pad. The third design principle is alignment, and alignment is a little bit trickier for some people. Alignment is really just covering the fact that you don't want to just throw something on the page. You want to be intentional about where you put everything. Sometimes it looks okay to have everything centered, but maybe not centered in the middle of the page, horizontal and vertically. Maybe center it and put it at the bottom of the page, like the "Don't forget to be awesome." Alignment is just really something that we'll play around with our layers, kind of fitting them all together. I have included 3 different examples just to kind of give you a really introductory idea about alignment. The last design principle is proximity, and it's the one that honestly we'll use the least. Proximity just means the grouping of similar topics. If you look at the Students Love Technology example, this is an infographic, and infographics really use proximity tons. You can see they have the little iPod with a fact, and they have Post-it notes with a fact, and then you'll see the iPad with different facts. Those different groupings are going to have facts on similar topics, but enough different that they wanted to kind of show a little bit of space, that they don't go exactly together. Infographics are actually really neat, and I really enjoy them. It's a way to get a lot of information out to your audience in a really kind of interesting format, and a way that makes reading what you're reading much more interesting. So that's proximity. We're not really going to look at it tons, like I said, but it's very handy whenever we're doing stuff like infographics. And this would actually be something that would be awesome to use for some sort of school project, creating an infographic. So what we just looked at were our 4 guiding design principles: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. And the acronym that makes me giggle or at least smile every time would be CRAP. The next thing that we're going to look at is something that I think is a whole lot of fun, and that is how to use typography or fonts in your designs. So now let's look at some rules for using text. Some of them are going to be pretty basic and pretty easy to get, and others will be a little bit harder to grasp and a little bit more subjective, which just means what you might think looks okay might not look okay for what we are trying to do, and that's to design for an audience. So let's look at the first one, and that is avoid the default fonts. And those would be things like Times New Roman, those fonts that are always on your computer. And it's just because they're used a lot. The next one uses something that we just kind of learned about, and that is contrast. And it tells you to use contrasting font families. So when you're designing, you'll have one thing that's called a headline font and one that's called a body font or a secondary font. And basically what you want to do is make sure that you have one more designed font, which would be that headline font. So I kind of think of it as the fun font. And then your secondary font is going to be very clean and simple. Think about those watermarks that we made, or just a nice, clean font. This is the one where we have the most problems, and that is watch the legibility. And I know you've heard me say it over and over. I just said it, is nice, clean fonts. Now, I know that this says legibility, but it's really difficult to see. And if your audience doesn't know what you're saying, you might I just have a little bit of confusion. So just save those funky fonts and don't use those except for very, very sparingly. Next, you'll definitely want to steer clear of cliche and just kind of ugly fonts. Now, these are the ones that, again, are default on your computers, and people have thought, oh, well, that looks nice. And so it's just been used over and over and over again. We have our Comic Sans that teachers love to use because they think it's fun and it looks like handwriting. And it's just, in the design world, they're kind of a no-no because they're overused, and now it's just kind of a joke to use them. So we definitely don't want to use those. We want to move beyond that and find some new original fonts that we can use instead. We have already looked at this one also, and that's to adjust your line spacing. And you might not realize it, but we have looked at that, and I have told you to make sure that your words are on separate lines, and that's how you adjust your line spacing. You don't want the default area in between. You kind of want to think of it as a puzzle. And if you look at the first one, those adjust your line, the adjust your is one line and the line spacing is another. And so I was able to move it around and make it all look like it belongs together using our old friend proximity. And on the bottom one that says adjust your line spacing, I just hit enter and it just has the basic width. We don't want to do that. We always want to have different lines on our design. Here we have an actual name for something that we looked at when we were looking at contrast, and that is reverse type. And that's where your background is a color instead of just white. There are times when you can use it and it can look great. I actually really like the title that I made where it says of reverse type. You definitely don't need to avoid it totally, but you do want to avoid the examples here that we have, the yellow on orange, the red on the blue, which a lot of people like. We just want to make sure it's outlined in white or something. You don't want to do any fancy fonts because they're hard to read. You just want thick, nice, clean, simple fonts. When designing, it's a good idea to use 2 fonts. just to add a little bit of interest to your design. Now, there are circumstances where one font is perfectly fine, especially with typography posters, but two fonts is always a good policy. You usually have a headline font. In this example, they're kind of both headline fonts, but more the script font with U's, and then your secondary font would be the two fonts. It's just a little bit more simple, even though it is a little bit bigger in this example. The last and probably actually the most important rule would be to know the font's personality. You don't want to make the mistake of choosing a serious font when you are creating something that's light-hearted. So make sure that the font that you choose matches the mood that you are trying to create with whatever it is you're creating. Your invitation, your poster, whatever you're making, your font needs to match the mood.